Our guest speaker today is part of our community here at Houston Oasis. Jerry Friedman has been involved in the social justice community, especially animal advocacy, since the 1990s. After dropping out of large animal veterinary school, he is a published author, international speaker, a humane educator, and grassroots activist. Formerly the president of the Animal Care Foundation, vice president of In Defense of Animals, and board member of Animal Haven, the National Lawyers Guild, Los Angeles, and the Cannon River STEM School. Jerry now practices federal law in the greater Houston area. Let us welcome Jerry Friedman.
Thank you everybody for having me here. I enjoy being part of the community. And my presentation, I'm actually presenting this formally in a few weeks in April to an international conference here in Houston. I would really enjoy your critical feedback, whether it's here in Q&A session afterwards, or if you have any questions later on. I'd like to hear from you how to improve the presentation. So the presentation is Brain Envy, Why Eating Meat Did Not Cause the Human Brain to Grow. Technical issues. The issue why we're here. The issue why I'm here is fantastic. It's working. All right. So when I once heard that that meat caused the human brain to grow, intuitively this didn't make any sense to me because, of course, we have these great meat eaters, the Tyrannosaurus Rex. None of them have graduated from college. None of them have gone through rocket science. And so intuitively, I just didn't understand how eating meat would cause a brain to grow. We don't see this anywhere else in nature. And I'll add that as an atheist, I have learned to listen and reject mythologies, cultural mythologies. And normally we think of mythology in the religious context, Adam and Eve or what have you. But we have cultural mythologies as well, and many of us have these cultural mythologies handed down from religion. For example, the inferiority of women, which is a mythology, and we're still fighting against that, or the inferiority of other races, other human races. And we're fighting against these cultural mythologies. And so for me, a cultural mythology in and of itself, it doesn't matter unless it hurts somebody. And so if our culture is to put ice in water, which they don't do in Europe, well, that's fine, right? But when a cultural mythology actually hurts someone, these need to be challenged. And so the idea that meat caused the human brain to grow is some sort of a basis to say that we have an obligation to eat meat. We need to eat meat because our ancestors ate meat, and if our ancestors didn't do it, we would be stupid, right? So the point here in the presentation is that not only did meat not cause the human brain to grow, but plants didn't either. It's not really related to diet, but some of us have heard this. Leora Keith is an author. She said, you can go back 4 million years to the very beginning of the human race, and there is no question that we were hunters. This is what we ate for literally 4 million years, and it's the reason why we have really big brains. This is the idea that's in society. So what did some of the researchers have to say about that? This is Leslie Aiello. She's the author, one of the authors of the expensive tissue hypothesis. She says the incorporation of increasingly greater amounts of animal products into the diet was essential in the evolution of a large human brain. Another researcher, Catherine Milton, says without meat, it's unlikely that proto-humans could have secured enough energy and nutrition from the plants available in their African environment at that time to evolve into the active, sociable, intelligent creatures they became. And finally, we have Henry Bunn, who does not equivocate, meat made us human. All right. So this is the backdrop. This is where science is at the moment. And I didn't go over all the scientists. There are some anthropologists who disagree with this, but I'm not talking about the scientists who agree with me. I'm talking about the ones that disagree with me. All right. So for background, things to think about when thinking about the things being presented. All right, this is everybody's ancestor. Do you recognize her? Plesiadapis. Every time I practice the name it works, but Plesiadapis. Plesiadapis is a proto-primate. She lived 58 million years ago, and she ate fruits and leaves. So all primates come from her. As we advance through time, sorry about those on this side of the room. If you want to move over, I'll try to stay out of the way. As we go from 58 million years ago to 50, 40, 30, 20, 13 million years ago, we have a long history of eating plants, and 13 million years ago, orangutans branched off. 9 million years ago, gorillas branched off, and we go to 6 million years ago, which is our last common ancestor with the chimpanzees, who fed on fruits, leaves, and grass. So going to 6 million years ago on the left, branched down, we have chimpanzees and bonobos. So Australopithecines here on the side, Australopithecines, their brain was about 450 cubic centimeters. I don't have it down here. The chimpanzees and bonobos are about 350 cubic centimeters. So you can see shortly after 6 million years ago, we added 100 cubic centimeters. As we're going forward, we have scavenging point A, which I'll talk about, but we have Homo habilis at 800, so we had almost a doubling of brain size to this point. We have Homo erectus 1100. We have Neanderthals 1500. We have humans. We peaked at 1500. We shrank to 1350, which I'll talk about. In this whole process, at scavenging point A, this is the earliest evidence we have of humans or pre-humans eating any meat. And then another million years later, we have scavenging point B, which is the second point where we have evidence. So we have no evidence between these 2 points, but because of scavenging A, we can assume that we were eating meat that early. We have climate change and controlled fire and Homo erectus around 1.8, 1.6 million years ago, which has an interesting relationship, how all those come together. Finally, going now from 0.6 million years ago, 600,000 years ago, we have the first spears developed at 500,000 years. We have archaic humans. This is mitochondrial Eve. Everybody here, this is your grandmother. We have major hunting. Full-scale hunting started around 50,000 years ago, and agriculture around 10,000 years ago. So this is the background of the evolution of humans and how meat eating, spears, hunting, and so forth come into the argument. Pop quiz. I'll be gentle. All right. So if I tell you, I want to give you a logical frame to process this. If I tell you that in 18% of automobile accidents, a driver was sleeping from sleep deprivation, would you conclude that it's coincidence between the auto accident and sleep deprivation? Would you conclude it's correlation, or would you conclude it's causation?
Correlation.
This is correlation because we don't know who is the driver causing the accident, right? It could be the victim driver who had sleep deprivation. Or even if they were both sleep deprived, it could have been some other event. It could have been an earthquake. It could have been something. And so what I want to emphasize here, and what is commonly known in logic, is that correlation does not imply causation. So correlation is important if we have one epidemiological study, which is correlation. It doesn't tell us a whole lot. But if we have a series of epidemiological studies that all come to the same conclusion, it's still correlation, but we're more confident in the conclusion. We're more confident in causation. So when we see that there's this relationship between the eating of meat and the expansion of brain growth, we only have correlation. We haven't even touched causation yet. And the burden of proof, which was inspired by one of the talks on the Oasis private board, I want to emphasize that the burden of proof is on the person who makes the affirmative claim. The affirmative claim is meat caused the human brain to grow. That's the affirmative. They have to prove it. I don't have to prove anything otherwise. They have to prove it. Similarly, humans cause climate change. That's the affirmative. You have to prove it. Democracy is a superior form of government. Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated JFK, or who has heard this? God exists, right? These are affirmatives. These need to be proven. We don't need to prove the negative. There are exceptions. There's a traditional exception with atheists particularly. Does that traditional exception come to mind for anyone? When there is something that has so much data that it's no longer doubted or doubtable, like evolution, we don't have to prove evolution in every debate. There is so much data about evolution that now the negative needs to be proven, that evolution is false. So that's the exception, all right? And the last concept I want you to absorb is what's called evolutionary commitment. The more an organism evolves to live a certain way, the more difficult it is for the organism to change. The easy example given by Jared Diamond is with birds and egg laying. We would not expect birds to give live birth, such as with the duckling, because they have so much biological commitment to laying eggs that they have to roll back their evolutionary direction and switch tracks. And so this is a group of vegans here in Houston. It's the same concept that humans have a huge biological dedication to eating plants. We've had 60 million years or more of history, thank you. And so for them to eat cows, it's a huge shift in the biological track. All right, general contradictions. These are going to be the concepts of why, no matter who makes the argument, it doesn't make sense that meat made the human brain grow. Generally speaking, in the last 20,000 years, you may not know, the human brain has been shrinking. So 50,000 years ago, we have full-scale hunting. 20,000 years ago, the human brain starts to shrink. We have lost, as a species, brain mass the size of a tennis ball. So one of the ideas is, if meat is causing the brain to grow, and for the last 50,000 years, as a species, we have been eating more meat than ever. We have it available to us all the time. Then how did the human brain started shrinking? Why is it when you eat more meat, the brain shrinks? So no anthropologist has addressed this. Nobody understands why the brain, there isn't a formal scientific theory why the brain shrank. But we can see that it's counterintuitive for meat to cause the brain to grow. And then, whoa, let's make the brain shrink again. There are other primates whose brain has grown substantially without meat. So why are humans the exception? Spider monkeys and howler monkeys are both very closely related. They both evolved in the same environment. Spider monkeys prefer fruit, but howler monkeys prefer leaves. And the spider monkey brain is twice the size of a howler monkey brain. This was brought up by Catherine Milton, who did her dissertation on this, one of these scientists I mentioned earlier. So why humans are the exception to primates has not been discussed. The savanna has only produced animals with relatively small brains. So the elephant has a brain 5,000 grams. Humans are around 1,350. Elephant brain 5,000 grams, but their bodies are so large, their brain-to-body ratio is 1.2, give or take, depending upon the elephant you're looking at. Elephants, ratio 2.8, giraffe 1.7, zebra 0.9, lion 0.8, spotted hyena 0.4. Yet our ancient relatives, the Australopithecines, 2.2, and then the humans went up to 7.5. Now this supposedly all happened in the savanna environment, and so why is it that the savanna environment, this evolutionary chamber, has only produced small brains, relatively small brains, but somehow for humans, this environment caused our brain to grow, counterintuitive. And this correlation, same correlation with carnivores. This goes back to Tyrannosaurus rex. Lions, 0.8, spotted hyena, 0.4 again. Gray wolf, 0.3, grizzly bear, 0.4, house cat, 0.6, alligators, 0.00009. If you're a carnivore, you're comparing your body and your brain, you have a very small brain. And yet, people say that somehow eating meat or hunting caused the human brain to grow. It's again counterintuitive. How many people know that the alligator used tools? Has anybody heard that alligators use tools?
Yes.
Got a couple. So there's alligators that were studied and the results published last year. Alligators would swim in lakes or rivers, they would gather sticks on their head, and they would go to the riverbank. And when birds would come to collect the sticks, the alligators would get the birds. You don't need much brains for tool use, right? A lot of animals use tools with small brains. So this is specific researcher development. The paradigm we're under is man the hunter. The idea is that the more successful hunters get more meat, more brain. The smarter you are, the better a hunter you are. The better the hunter you are, the more you feed your family. You feed your family better than the vegetarians, right? And so you're getting more food for your family with a bigger brain because you're smarter, and your genes will gradually bring your brain size up. It's lifting the humans from a small brain to a large brain because we're hunting, we're smart hunters. So this is the paradigm from the 1950s which I'll show at the end is no longer accepted. Let's go to the physical evidence, and this is what a lot of people will encounter with physical evidence. We have tools showing cutting meat from bones or smashing bones. Let me switch sides here. So we have a smashed bone here, probably to get marrow, and we have cut marks. It's probably difficult to see. You have cut marks on the bone, which is probably cutting muscles away from the limbs. All right. So we have physical evidence, and this is what Henry Bunn uses for his argument. So around 2 million years ago, he goes to a remarkably well-preserved site. We have volcanic ash that preserves all this evidence. And in this site, there are a minimum of 48 large animals who accumulated over several years. If we use round numbers, 50 large animals over 5 years, we have about 10 large animals per year. 10 large animals per year is less than 1 large animal per month. That's not a lot of meat. There were also a large number of small animals. We don't know how many. It's hard to estimate. But given all this, we have no evidence of universality. And what I mean by that is we don't know if this one site 2 million years ago is typical or if it's an unusual apex. We don't know enough to claim how common this practice is. We have no idea of the meat yield, how much meat was on these bones. Were they hunted, which is unusual? It's unlikely, because these Homo habilis were fairly short. They had no weapons. So imagining them hunting oxen or wild boar is unlikely. They probably were scavenged. If they're scavenged, we have lions eating them, we have hyenas eating them. How much meat is left? We don't know how much of it is the meat yield. We don't know about competition with other scavengers and decay. So let's say they have a carcass, let's say they have a large carcass. They can't preserve it. They don't have salt, they don't have smoke, they don't have refrigerators, right? And each night, even the researcher says that each night it's likely that hyenas would come and take any carcasses that are there. And so if they have a carcass, how much meat could they really get from that? Maybe 1 or 2 meals before it rots? We don't know what the human population was at the time. Were these carcasses eaten by 5 individuals, 50 individuals? We don't know these things, and we don't have evidence of the whole diet. And this is really key. We have stones and fossils that preserve really well, but we don't know what kind of plants they were eating, because wood and fruits, they don't preserve well. And so here we have an analysis where we have one data point, but we don't know the other data, and we can't really make any conclusions based off this data. There was one, so the Australopithecines, as I mentioned, they eat grass. And there was one set of remains of Australopithecines where there were not grass marks on the teeth, no abrasion on the teeth. And so the researcher who was looking at this said, well, if they have grass in their bones, we have C4 markers in the bones, but we don't have the wear on the teeth, then it must mean that they were eating grass-eating animals, like they were eating cows, for example. And by eating cows, they're getting those grass markers indirectly. So these chemical analyses, they're intrinsically accurate, but without more data, it's like a police detective who uses thumbprints to convict somebody. And if you just have one set of data, it's not very good. You want to have more information, right? And so something similar happened with Neanderthals in the year 2000 about. Neanderthal bones were analyzed, they had a high protein content. And so if there's a high protein content in the bones, what do you think the researchers concluded? Neanderthals ate a lot of meat. 10 years later, 2010 and 2012, they analyzed dental plaque. Imagine analyzing the dental plaque of Neanderthals. And in the dental plaque, they found a tremendous number of plant particles and a little bit of lipids, a little bit of animal fats. And the researchers said, well, we tended to assume that if you had high protein in the bones, that they ate a lot of meat, but they could have gotten some of the protein from plants. So it's the same idea with the Australopithecines. We have one data point that they have grass in their bones, and this particular set of bones, they didn't have any abrasion on their teeth, and the researcher says, oh, they must have eaten a lot of meat. We know that they ate plants because they had conical ribs. And what does that mean? Our ribs are cylindrical, they're vertical on the sides, but if you look at chimpanzees and Australopithecines, they branch out. They branch out because they had large colons. They needed room for their colon to fit. And why would an animal have a large colon? Well, cows ferment grass in front of the stomach. Horses ferment grass behind the stomach. in the colon, and so did Australopithecines. And so we know that they must have eaten grass. They had large colons. That's the only reason to have large colons. And so the idea is that this guy has not proven that the Australopithecines he looked at, they didn't eat grass. So what would explain there being no tooth abrasion? Tiger nuts. I love saying this, tiger nuts. Who knows what tiger nuts are? Don't give me anything base. Tiger nuts are a type of grass. They're actually the bulb underground of grass. And so there's a lot of reasons to have these C4 markers in grass without eating the grass leaves, but by eating the tiger nuts. And there's very good reason to believe that they ate tiger nuts, which I'll address very soon. All right, this is Natalie's favorite slide. It's called the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. Anybody familiar with it? Texas sharpshooter fallacy. I don't know why it says Texas, but this is the idea. You take a gun, you shoot the side of the barn, you go up to the barn, and you draw a target around it. The idea is that you have one set of data that you use both for your hypothesis and your test. You don't have any corroborating data. And so the idea with Stephen Clark, another anthropologist, he says that humans, Ted Nugent, he says that humans enjoy hunting, they like eating meat. Chimpanzees, they enjoy hunting and like eating meat. Well, if these two did, then probably all of them did, all the way back to our last common ancestor. They all enjoy hunting and eating meat, all right? So we have one set of data, and that's what we're forming our conclusion with, that's what we're doing our test with. So already we have the fallacy of the Texas sharpshooter, we have another fallacy, biased sample. Why didn't he include bonobos? Bonobos are equally related to us, and they don't enjoy eating meat. They're meat averse. They may eat a few insects, that's about it. If he had included bonobos in his analysis, he couldn't come up with his conclusion. And so I find in the research, if you read it and think about it, a lot of these fallacies come up. Another point, how large did I say their brains were? 350 cubic centimeters. So what's the idea with the humans? We ate meat, our brains grew. Chimpanzees eat meat, and their brains stayed the same. Something else has to be going on. All right, the expensive tissue hypothesis. And it looks like I'm running short on time, so I will be talking a little faster. Expensive tissue hypothesis says that our ancient ancestors had a small brain and a large gut, but as we evolved, our brain grew and our gut shrank. Both organs use about the same amount of energy pound for pound, and so we see that in order to get a larger brain, our guts shrank, our bodies borrowed from Peter to pay Paul. But when we have a smaller gut, we have less surface area to absorb nutrients, so we need more calories in our nutrients to make our guts more efficient. And so what did we eat for more calories? Well, we ate meat, but we could also eat cooked food. Cooking food releases a lot of calories. There's a lot of evidence of cooked food as far back as 1.6 million years ago, and of course, if the evidence is 1.6 million years, maybe it goes a little farther back. The problem with this idea is they missed a third variable. It's another biased sample. What is that third variable? These researchers only analyzed the gut as a whole, but we have a stomach, a large intestine, a small intestine, and these serve different functions. Catherine Milton, again, she researched the individual organs, and instead of just pointing out that 4 million years ago our brains were small, our gut was large, and then as our brain grew, our gut shrank, she looked at the changing proportions, and as the proportions changed, look at the small intestine in blue, the small intestine grew. And so even though the gut as a whole shrank, which is what the original researchers said, actually the small intestine lengthened, making it more efficient. And why is this? Our ancestors were eating less grass and eating more fruits, tubers, and other vegetables. Let me just read what Catherine Milton says here. The brain is a relentless consumer of calories. It needs glucose 24 hours a day. Animal protein probably did not provide any of those calories, which were more likely to come from carbohydrates. What are carbohydrates? Are fruits and vegetables. But Catherine Milton is not entirely on board. She says, we still needed meat because the human baby, the brain grows dramatically. The baby, when they're born, their brain grows faster than almost any other animal, and then it starts to slow. And in order to support that brain growth, you need essential fatty acids, in other words, omega-3s, and they must have gotten omega-3s from meat. but actually meat is not the only source of essential fatty acids. Algae is. How do we know that our ancestors ate algae? They ate plants that grew along rivers and lakes, which we can infer had algae on it. Nuts and seeds, already nuts and seeds, walnuts, flax seeds have high omega-3s. We know these food sources were available. And as I said, tiger nuts are very rich in fatty acids. So there's plenty of natural places for them to get these nutrients, and none of these researchers have provided proof otherwise. All right. So I will give you one alternative hypothesis. There's only one strong alternative hypothesis, in my opinion. There are several of how the brain grew. So we have the human animal. Does anybody recognize her by chance? Alice Walker, very good. All right, so we have the human animal. Let me ask you, is this a social or a non-social animal? Social, humans are social. Large brain or small brain? Large brain, of course. So we'll get just a little more difficult. This animal, bottlenose dolphin, social or not?
Social.
Very social. Large brain, small brain? Very large brain. They are the second most encephalized animal after humans. All right, how about crows? Are they social or not? They are very social. Large brain or small brain? For birds, they have a very large brain. All right, how about ants? Social or not? Social, of course. Large brain, ganglia, or small brain. They have a very large ganglia for insects. And this one might be a little tricky. Spotted hyena, social or not? Spotted hyena are the most social of the 4 species of hyena, large brain or small brain. They have a small brain, but for hyenas, they have the largest brain. And so the competing theory, which I think is the primary theory, is that society, socializing is what caused the human brain to grow. For example, I have written here, development of language, outsmarting predators, problem solving, planning and awareness of time, sensory interpretation, and a more sophisticated understanding of the world. The part of the human brain that grew is in language. It's the Broca's area. We have our prefrontal cortex that grew tremendously, planning of time, accounting, etc. And so the idea that eating meat or hunting caused the brain to grow, when it has no relationship to the part of the brain that grew, but then we're looking at the social factors that cause the human brain to grow and how the brain actually developed in those areas. This is the kind of correlation that to me makes sense and not the theories from the 1950s. All right, in conclusion, burden of proof is on the affirmative, right? Correlation does not imply causation. If in doubt, remember correlation of the savanna environment does not produce large brains, and carnivores do not generally have large brains, except for the social bottlenose dolphin. No evidence of the relationship between the history of hunting and brain growth. There is no evidence of the amount of meat in the pre-human or early human diet, especially because we don't know how many plants they ate. When meat has been most available, the human brain has been shrinking. Brain growth, gut shrinkage, and the lengthening of the small intestine are explained by high-calorie food, and carbohydrates are the better candidate. The areas of the brain that grew correspond to social skills, of which foraging behaviors are one, of which eating meat is one. So that gives a disproportionate emphasis on meat when there's no reason to give that disproportionate emphasis. Okay, so I hope that was fast enough. How much time do we have for Q&A, or do we?
6.5 minutes.
6.5 minutes for Q&A. I saw this hand first.
I was just wondering, was there any, two things. One was was there any data or any analysis, because I noticed most of the example species were mammalian, about breast milk and the nutrient density in the breast milk, how long were the infants nursed, and how much volume was produced per, based on animal size.
The only data I've seen on that was included in the research was Catherine Milton saying that the human babies after weaning, she said that they needed to eat meat in order to sustain the fatty acids. So that's post-weaning. I haven't seen any data or research on weaning itself, which might be my inability to discover this. but I haven't found anything that relates to weaning except for what Catherine Milton said.
And another question I had was on the social behavior versus brain size. Which one caused which? Is there a way to correlate which one caused which?
So Robert Sussman, Donna Hart wrote a book, Man Hunted, and they emphasize well, it's hard to say if the river makes the riverbed or the riverbed makes the river. They believe it's the behavior that's rewarded with larger brain size, but it's going to be a difficult test. We don't have any behavioralists able to tell us how Australopithecines behaved. In the back?
I don't think it's meat. There's a bunch of things that the bonobos do some things, and chimpanzees, yes, eat meat, and there's some other primates that eat meat. It's the amount of calories that you take in. And there's some strong evidence that that which you use the most gets the most replacement or the most growth. If you use a muscle more, the muscle gets better. I think that applies to the brain too. The more you use it, the better it gets.
Yeah, evolutionarily, if whatever you use promotes your survival, then that's definitely going to be rewarded.
And
do you have a question?
being social,
we don't have much time.
as well as having a high enough calorie intake to have spare time. Most of your herbivores spend almost all of their time eating.
Do you have a question? We're in a Q&A session and we don't have much time.
How do you correlate calorie intake as whatever it's nuts, raisin, and or meat as a causing factor in brain growth or use?
I don't propose, as I said at the beginning, that plants or animals eating either cause brain growth. It's fuel. And so if you ask yourself how to get to the mall, you get to the mall with your car, but you need fuel to get to the mall. You have fuel for your car. Whether that fuel comes from plants or animals, it doesn't matter. But the evidence of human history is that we've been almost exclusively plant eaters until 50,000 years ago. We had a question in front.
Yeah. I noticed none of the data or none of the research took into account insects.
We had, the history is that if you go back 90 million years, our relatives back then ate a little bit of insects, and there's been a continuing small amount of diet of insects, but it's been a minority.
So they actually can test to see how much insects were like bone marrow.
I haven't seen the data that supports that. It's believed. It's believed that our most ancient relatives had insects in their diet, and then that habit has not changed. You see in primates today, gorillas,
So they don't know. It may be the African savannah could have had a large portion of the diet could have been insects too. Then.
Yeah, it could have been. There's no evidence to support that.
But there's no evidence to not support it.
Right, but you don't have to prove a negative. You have to prove a positive. All right. Back here.
Yeah, there's a lot of fossils, spears, knives, and all that. What's the guess? What's the inference while that effort was made for these sharp tools? You don't need sharp tools to spear a piece
Right,
of
so
corn.
the inference is that the sharpened tools are used to render meat, but we don't know how much meat. We don't know if it was scavenged or hunted. The evidence, in my interpretation of the evidence, is that they were scavenged.
Yeah.
And so there's no question, and I hope I presented, there's no question that our ancestors ate some meat. The question is, what did the meat play in the development of the human brain?
Of all those fossils, how many were devoted for grinding up grain and tools made for grain?
None that I've seen for the research that I've looked at. But again, grain, these plants don't fossilize. This is a problem of anthropology worldwide. We just don't have data there. We know that that our ancient ancestors used wooden digging tools. Well, what were they digging for? They were digging for probably tubers. Tubers can be up to 100 pounds. And so if you get some Australopithecines who unearth tubers that are 100 pounds, they preserve pretty well. This is a huge benefit to them. There were tuber-eating pigs that would unearth tubers. They could have chased away these pigs to eat the tubers as well. So but the tubers don't fossilize, and these wooden digging sticks, they don't fossilize. And so there's no doubt that they use these implements for meat, but we don't know how much of other things there's too many variables to make a conclusion.
Last question.
Last question. Does anybody urgently, I'll go for the youngster, get some youth involved.
How do you get vitamin B12 without meat?
Probably insects. Probably insects is the way to get B12. Also, B12, where does it come from? It comes from bacteria that lives in the soil. So presumably in the African environment, that's not as sterilized as we have right now. They'll be eating plants that have dirt, they eat the dirt, they get the bacteria, they get the B12. It's the same place for insects. Where insects get B12, they get it from the bacteria. Where do animals get B12? They get it from the bacteria. So whether our relatives got it straight from the soil or indirectly through insects, we don't know. Termites are very high in B12. Flies are very low in B12. They may be eating termites. Okay, thank you. If you have any questions later, please approach